The date is January 26, 1945. The location is Ramree Island, a jagged scar of land off the coast of Burma that would soon become the setting for the single most terrifying event in the history of warfare. The Battle of Ramree was, for all strategic purposes, already finished. The British Royal Navy had executed a masterful encirclement, their destroyers and battleships forming a steel ring around the island, cutting off every avenue of escape by sea. The sky was dominated by the Royal Air Force, and the beaches were being pulverized by heavy artillery that shook the earth miles away. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the situation was not just desperate, it was terminal. The occupying force, once a proud regiment of elite soldiers, had been whittled down to a hardened core of approximately 1,000 men. They were tired, they were low on ammunition, and they were completely trapped. Commanding this doomed force was Colonel Kenichi Nagasawa, a man whose adherence to the Bushido Code was absolute. To Nagasawa, surrender was a concept that did not exist. It was a spiritual death far worse than any physical destruction. When the British commanders sent a message offering an honorable surrender, promising food, water, and medical treatment for his wounded men, Nagasawa didn't hesitate. He sent back a reply that would seal the fate of every man under his command. "We will fight to the last breath." But fighting on the beaches was no longer an option. The British bombardment was turning the coastline into a lunar landscape of craters and shrapnel. To stay was suicide. To surrender was dishonor. That left only one option, a choice that seemed tactically sound on a map, but would prove to be a descent into a hell that no map could depict. Nagasawa ordered a retreat into the interior. His plan was to march his 1,000 men across 10 miles of mangrove swamp to reach the other side of the island, where he hoped to regroup with a larger Japanese battalion. 10 miles. For a disciplined army, a 10-mile march is nothing. It is a morning's work. But Ramree Island was not normal terrain. The interior was a prehistoric labyrinth of black mud, twisted roots, and stagnant water, a place where the sun struggled to pierce the canopy and the air hung heavy with the smell of sulfur and decay. As the Japanese column turned their backs on the British guns and stepped into the tree line, a British commander aboard a destroyer lowered his binoculars. He watched the enemy disappear into the shadows of the mangroves. One of his junior officers asked if they should continue the bombardment, to shell the swamp and finish them off. The commander shook his head slowly. "Let them go," he said, his voice grim. "We don't need to waste the ammunition. The swamp will do the work for us." The British sailors standing on the deck shivered, despite the tropical heat. They knew what lived in those tidal wetlands. They knew that Ramree Island was home to the largest population of saltwater crocodiles on the planet, apex predators that had been undisturbed for centuries. And due to the war, the local wildlife had been starving. The descent into the nightmare began at midday. The moment the Japanese soldiers stepped off the solid ground and into the mangroves, the war of bullets and bombs ceased, replaced by a war against nature itself. The mud was the first enemy. It wasn't just dirt, it was a thick, glue-like sludge that sucked at their boots with every step. Within the first hour, the march slowed to a crawl. The mud varied in depth, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, hiding sinkholes that could swallow a man whole. Soldiers had to use their rifles as walking sticks, prying their legs free from the muck, their uniforms instantly soaked in a foul, black liquid that smelled of rotten eggs and ancient death. The heat was suffocating. The mangrove canopy trapped the humidity, turning the swamp into a steam bath that drained the men of their strength. Then came the insects. As the column disrupted the stagnant air, clouds of mosquitoes rose from the water, so thick they looked like gray smoke. They swarmed the soldiers' faces, biting through clothing, filling their noses and ears. But the mosquitoes were merely a nuisance compared to the leeches. They dropped from the twisted branches above and swam through the oily water below, attaching themselves to necks, wrists, and eyelids. Men would look down to see their arms covered in bloating, blood-filled parasites. They had to burn them off with cigarettes or tear them off with their fingernails, leaving open wounds that immediately began to fester in the filthy water. Morale began to disintegrate. These were soldiers who had fought the Americans, who had endured artillery barrages and bonsai charges, but this sluggish, silent torture was breaking them. By sunset, the regiment was exhausted. They had planned to cross the 10 miles in a day. In reality, they had covered less than 2. The intricate web of mangrove roots, which grew in arched loops like ribs of a skeleton, made walking in a straight line impossible. They had to climb over, duck under, and wade through an obstacle course designed by nature to trap anything that entered. Colonel Nagasawa, seeing the fatigue in his men's eyes, ordered a halt. "We rest here," he commanded. "Find purchase on the tree roots. Keep out of the mud. Do not touch the water unless necessary." It was a strange order, born of a primal instinct that something was wrong with the water. It was murky, brackish, a mix of salt and fresh water, and completely opaque. Nothing could be seen beneath the surface. Private Tanaka, a young conscript who had barely finished his training before being shipped to Burma, was too tired to care about the colonel's unease. His feet were blistered and raw from the wet boots. He found a low-hanging mangrove branch, thick enough to support his weight, and sat down. He unlaced his boots, peeled off his rotting socks, and dangled his legs into the cool, dark water. It felt like heaven. The stinging of the insect bites faded slightly. He leaned his head back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to dream of his home in Osaka, of rice paper walls and clean tatami mats. He didn't see the ripple. The water around his legs didn't splash. It didn't churn. It just bulged slightly, a displacement of volume that went unnoticed in the twilight. A massive shape, darker than the surrounding mud and older than the war itself, rose silently from the depths. This was the first blood. The attack, when it came, was terrifyingly silent. One moment, Private Tanaka was sitting on the branch, breathing softly. The next, he was simply gone. There was no scream, not initially. There was just a wet, heavy thwack sound, like a soaked towel hitting a slab of granite. The soldier sitting 3 feet away, a corporal named Sato, turned his head. "Tanaka?" he whispered. He saw only the empty branch swaying gently and expanding ripples on the black water. For a second, Sato thought Tanaka had fallen in, perhaps fainted from exhaustion. Then, 10 yards away, the water erupted. Tanaka surfaced, but he wasn't swimming. He was screaming, a high-pitched, gargling shriek that cut through the humid air like a knife. He was being thrashed from side to side with violent, impossible force. A creature 20 feet long, armored in prehistoric scales and covered in the slime of the swamp, had him by the waist. It was a saltwater crocodile, the largest reptile on Earth, a living dinosaur that had survived extinction events only to find a feast delivered to its doorstep. The beast performed the death roll, spinning its massive body underwater to tear its prey apart. Tanaka's scream was cut short as he was dragged under the surface. Bubbles of bright red blood rose to the top, popping with sickening clarity in the quiet swamp. The regiment froze. The silence that followed was heavier than the scream. "Shoot it!" an officer finally yelled, his voice cracking. A dozen Arasaka rifles were raised, firing blindly into the water where Tanaka had vanished. Bang, bang, bang! The shots echoed through the trees, scaring birds from the canopy, but the bullets hit the water harmlessly, losing their velocity in the dense liquid. The beast was gone. The water settled, but the blood remained. Colonel Nagasawa stood up on a high root, drawing his katana, though he knew the blade was useless here. He looked out into the gathering darkness. The sun was setting rapidly now, and as the light faded from the sky, the swamp began to change. It started as a subtle shift in the environment. The chirping of the crickets stopped. The birds went silent. And then, the swamp began to glow. It wasn't the soft, flickering light of fireflies. It was steady, cold, and predatory. Hundreds of small yellow dots appeared on the surface of the water. Then hundreds more. They appeared in pairs. Eyes. The soldiers realized with a jolt of primal terror that they were surrounded. They hadn't walked into a sanctuary. They had walked into a feeding ground. The noise of the rifles, the scent of Tanaka's blood, and the vibrations of 1,000 men moving through the mud had rung the dinner bell. The crocodiles of Ramree Island were waking up. Night fell like a hammer blow. In the dense canopy of the mangroves, there was no moonlight, no starlight. It was pitch black, a darkness so complete it felt physical. The Japanese soldiers, elite warriors trained to fight in jungles and cities, were reduced to frightened children clinging to the mangrove roots like monkeys. They used their leather belts to tie themselves to the trees, terrified that if they fell asleep and slipped into the water, they would never wake up. But the crocodiles didn't wait for them to fall. Saltwater crocodiles are unique among reptiles. They are hunters that observe, calculate, and adapt. They are one of the few species that actively hunt humans, and they have a terrifying ability. They can launch themselves out of the water using the explosive power of their tails. The massacre began in earnest an hour after dark. The first scream came from the rear guard, a straggler who had been waist-deep in mud trying to catch up. Then another scream from the left flank. Splash, scream, crunch. The sound of human bones breaking echoed through the trees, a wet, grinding noise that made the soldiers vomit in fear. It sounded like dry branches snapping, but wetter. "They are climbing!" a soldier yelled from the darkness. A massive crocodile, sensing the heat of the bodies above, had launched itself onto a low mud bank, scrabbling up the slick roots with terrifying speed. It grabbed an officer by the leg. The officer fired his Nambu pistol wildly, the muzzle flashes illuminating the pale yellow belly of the beast for brief, strobe-like seconds. The flashes revealed a nightmare. The crocodile's jaws were locked onto the man's thigh, and with a single jerk of its head, it dragged him down into the slime. The water splashed over the roots, washing away his frantic claw marks. Panic, the enemy of all armies, broke out. The iron discipline of the Imperial Army, which had withstood British bayonet charges, American flamethrowers, and aerial bombardment, crumbled before the monsters. Soldiers started firing blindly into the dark, wasting precious ammunition on shadows and ripples. They threw hand grenades into the water. Boom! The explosions lit up the swamp for split seconds, revealing a scene from the deepest pits of hell. The water was churning with reptiles. Some were 15 feet long, some were 20. They were fighting each other for the bodies of the dead and the dying, thrashing in a frenzy of blood and mud. And with every explosion, with every splash, more came. They were moving closer, sliding over the mud, their bellies scraping against the roots, their eyes fixed on the trembling men in the trees. The smell of fresh blood was overwhelming the smell of the swamp, driving the reptiles into a feeding frenzy that defied nature. 2 miles offshore, on the deck of a British Royal Navy patrol boat, a young signalman stood watch on the quiet sea. The ocean was calm, the stars were out, and the war felt very far away. But then he heard it. The air coming from the island was vibrating. At first, the British crew thought it was a counterattack, perhaps a riot within the Japanese ranks. But as they listened closer, the blood drained from their faces. It was the cacophony of thousands of men screaming at once. These were not battle cries. These were screams of pure, primal terror, the sound of prey being torn apart. Mixed with the screams was the sporadic, panicked popping of Arisaka rifles, and under it all, a low, wet thrashing sound, like a giant mixing bowl stirring meat. The British naturalist Bruce Wright, who was serving with the Navy and present that night, would later write a description that chills the blood to this day. That night was the most horrible that any member of the ML crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurring, worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. Back in the swamp, the Japanese soldiers were discovering a terrifying lesson in physics and biology. Bullets do not easily stop dinosaurs. A saltwater crocodile has armor-plated scales on its back, evolved over millions of years to protect it from other predators. Small-caliber bullets fired at an angle simply ricocheted off the tough hide, sparking into the night. Corporal Yamada was clinging to a mangrove root, his knuckles white. He saw a massive croc sliding through the mud toward his friend, Private Sato, who was trapped in a sinkhole. Yamada aimed his rifle. He was a marksman. He fired 3 shots directly at the crocodile's head. Ping, ping, ping. The bullets sparked off the skull, deflected by the thick bone. The crocodile didn't even flinch. It didn't pause. It opened its jaws, a mouth big enough to fit a human torso, and snapped shut on Sato's leg. The sound of the femur snapping was louder than the gunshot. Sato didn't just fall. He was yanked into the abyss with such violence that his helmet was left spinning on the mud. Yamada stared at his rifle in horror. "We are fighting tanks," he whispered to himself. "Living, breathing tanks that can swim." He dropped his rifle into the water. It was useless dead weight. He pulled his bayonet from his belt. If he was going to die, he would die stabbing, trying to find a soft spot in the armor of the beast. But deep down, he knew the bayonet was just a toothpick against a dragon. By 4 a.m., the situation became even more dire. The tide began to rise. This was the crocodile's home field advantage. As the water level rose, the mud banks where some soldiers had found refuge disappeared. The water crept up the trunks of the mangrove trees, forcing the men to climb higher into the fragile, twisted branches. But the trees were covered in slick moss and slime. The men were exhausted, dehydrated, and trembling with shock. One soldier, overcome by fatigue, nodded off for just a second. His grip loosened. Splash! He hit the water. Immediately, the water boiled. 3 crocodiles converged on the splash like torpedoes, fighting over the meal. The water turned frothy and red, the carnage illuminated only by the distant stars. The soldiers in the trees above watched in paralyzed silence. They couldn't help. If they climbed down, they died. They were trapped in cages made of branches, suspended over a pit of monsters that were patiently waiting for them to fall. The crocodiles, emboldened by the blood, started bumping the trees. They rammed the trunks with their massive snouts, using their weight to shake the fruit loose. Thud, shake, scream. The psychological toll was heavier than the physical one. Captain Ito, a proud officer of the Imperial Army who had dreamed of dying for the Emperor in a blaze of glory, looked at his decimated platoon. Out of 40 men under his direct command, only 12 were left clinging to the tree cluster. Below him, he could hear a crocodile chewing on something metallic, a helmet perhaps, or a canteen still attached to a severed hip. Ito couldn't take the sound of the crunching anymore. He couldn't take the screams of his men begging for their mothers in the dark. He looked at his Nambu pistol. He checked the magazine. He had 1 bullet left. He looked at the crocodiles circling below, their eyes reflecting the starlight. He looked at the gun. He made the samurai's choice. "Long live the Emperor," Ito whispered, though his voice was devoid of hope. He didn't shoot the crocodiles. He put the barrel in his own mouth. Bang! His body went limp and fell into the water. The crocodiles swarmed it instantly, tearing the uniform to shreds. For the survivors watching, This broke the last shred of their morale. They realized that death by a bullet was a luxury, a gift, and many of them began to reach for their own grenades, pulling the pins not to throw them at the enemy, but to hold them close to their chests. As the first light of dawn approached, the frenzy reached its peak. The smell of blood in the water had attracted every scavenger from miles around. Sharks moved into the river mouths to join the crocodiles. Vultures circled in the night sky, waiting for the leftovers. The swamp had become a churning machine of biological destruction, and the Japanese 54th Division was being erased from history. January 27, 1945, 06:30 hours. The sun rose over Ramree Island, piercing the morning mist with shafts of indifferent golden light. To the British commanders standing on the decks of their destroyers and patrol boats offshore, the sunrise revealed a scene that defied military comprehension. For hours they had listened to the cacophony of hell, the screams, the gunfire, the wet thrashing sounds that had traveled across the water like a physical wave of dread. But now, as the light hit the mangroves, the noise stopped. The screaming was gone. The gunfire was gone. The silence that followed was heavier, colder, and more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of a tomb. The British officers raised their binoculars, expecting to see the Japanese army entrenching themselves, preparing for a final stand. Instead, they saw the water. The tidal creeks that wound through the mangroves were no longer the murky brown of silt and mud. They were red. A thick crimson sludge moved slowly with the outgoing tide, staining the roots of the trees and trailing out into the bay. It was a river of blood, the life force of an entire regiment draining into the Indian Ocean. But the most terrifying sight was on the mudflats. As the tide receded, it revealed the architects of the massacre. Hundreds of saltwater crocodiles lay motionless on the banks. They were not hiding. They were basking. They looked bloated, their massive armored bodies distended from a feast of unprecedented scale. They lay in the sun, digesting the imperial army, surrounded by the detritus of war, helmets, rifles, torn backpacks, and shreds of uniforms. They looked like statues carved from prehistoric stone, the undisputed victors of a battle they hadn't even realized they were fighting. The British commander ordered patrol boats to enter the swamp. The crews were hesitant. They checked their weapons, manning the heavy machine guns on the bows, their fingers hovering over the triggers. They expected an ambush. They expected the Japanese to fire from the tree line. But there was no one left to fight. As the boats motored slowly into the red water, the sailors covered their noses. The smell was overpowering. A thick, metallic stench of copper and raw meat mixed with the swamp's natural sulfur. The vultures were already there. Great black birds circled in the sky or perched on the high branches, waiting for the crocodiles to leave so they could pick at the leftovers caught in the roots. They found the first survivor clinging to a high tree branch near the edge of the creek. It was a private named Yukio. He was unrecognizable as a soldier. His uniform was in tatters, stripped away by thorns and desperate struggles. He was covered in a layer of black mud and dried blood that formed a second skin. He had no weapon. His rifle was gone. His helmet was gone. He was staring at the water below him with eyes that didn't blink, pupils dilated to pinpoints of madness. When the British boat approached, its engine rumbling low, Yukio didn't react. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He didn't try to run. He just shivered, a violent, rhythmic shaking that rattled the branch he was holding. A British sailor, a young man who had seen combat, but never anything like this, reached out with a boat hook to pull the branch closer. Yukio flinched, letting out a shriek that sounded more animal than human. He scrambled back, pressing himself against the tree trunk, screaming at the water. He thought the sailor's hand was a jaw. He thought the boat was a beast. It took 3 men to physically pry him from the tree and drag him onto the deck. He curled immediately into a fetal position, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. He wasn't crying for his country or his honor. He was crying because the wood of the deck was solid. They pushed deeper into the swamp. They found another man buried up to his neck in the mud, hiding in a hole he had dug with his bare hands, catatonic with shock. They found another clinging to a root, missing a boot and half his foot, too weak to bleed out, just watching the crocodiles watching him. In total, the British rescue parties pulled 20 men out of the swamp. 20, out of 1,000 who had marched in the day before. The rest were gone. There were no bodies to bury. The swamp had consumed them entirely. The survivors were taken to a field hospital on the main British ship. The medical staff, hardened by years of war in the Pacific, were shocked by what they saw. These men weren't just physically injured. They were psychologically shattered. Their minds had snapped under the strain of a primal trauma that the human brain is not wired to process. When a nurse tried to give Private Yukio a cup of water, he knocked it away and screamed, backing into the corner of the medical tent. He couldn't look at the liquid. To him, water was no longer the source of life. It was the medium of death. It was the place where the teeth lived. Under interrogation, the Japanese prisoners were useless for military intelligence. The British intelligence officers tried to ask about troop movements, about supply lines, about the defense of the main island. The prisoners just stared blankly. They didn't speak of strategy or the emperor. They spoke of yellow eyes glowing in the dark. They spoke of the sound of bones snapping like dry twigs. They spoke of the demons that rose from the mud. One survivor, a sergeant who had lost his left arm, told the translator with a dead, flat voice, "The war is easy. Men shoot, and men miss. The swamp does not miss." They were prisoners of war, facing imprisonment and defeat, but they felt a profound sense of liberation. Any prison cell, any cage, was better than that mangrove hell. They were safe from the water, and that was all that mattered. The Ramree Island massacre would eventually enter the Guinness Book of World Records under a horrific title: the deadliest attack on humans by animals. Historians and naturalists have argued about the exact numbers for decades. Some skeptics claim it is impossible for crocodiles to eat that many men in a single night. They suggest that many died from drowning, or from the mud, or from their wounds. But the math of the survivors remains a brutal, stubborn fact. Approximately 1,000 elite soldiers entered the swamp. 20 came out alive. That is a casualty rate of 98%. Whether they died in the jaws of the beasts or drowned trying to escape them, the result was the same. The Japanese 54th Division wasn't defeated by British naval superiority or tactical genius. It was consumed by the ecosystem. The event served as a grim reminder to every soldier in the theater and to every historian who would later study it. War is not just man against man. It is man against the world, and the world is old, hungry, and indifferent to flags or causes. You can have the best machine guns, the sharpest bayonets, the most fanatical training, and the strongest will, but in the face of nature's apex predators, you are just meat. The technological superiority of the 20th century dissolved in the mud of Ramree, replaced by the prehistoric law of the food chain. Today, Ramree Island is quiet. The war is a distant memory, a chapter in a history book. The mangroves have grown back, their twisted roots concealing the bones and the rusted rifles that still lie deep in the muck. The saltwater crocodiles are still there. They remain the guardians of the swamp, the kings of the tidal creeks. They float silently in the brackish water, watching, waiting. The locals, the Burmese fishermen who navigate these waters, know better than to enter the deep mangroves after dark. They share stories in hushed tones. They say that the crocodiles of Ramree are bigger than anywhere else, fed on the souls of a lost army. They say that on the anniversary of the retreat, If you turn off your boat engine and listen closely to the wind whistling through the trees, you can still hear them. You can hear the panic. You can hear the screams of the Imperial Army, forever marching through the mud, forever trying to escape the jaws of the dark. The ghosts of Ramree are not resting, they are still running. This story forces us to look at the terrifying reality of nature when it is disturbed by the violence of man. It is a horror story where the monsters are real, and they are still out there, swimming in the black water. If this descent into history's darkest swamp gave you chills, if the thought of those yellow eyes in the dark made your heart race, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that dig up the history others are afraid to touch. We bring you the truth, no matter how terrifying. And remember, when you are near the water's edge in the dark, watch the surface.